Shavuot is the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. More specifically, or more generally, it's the giving of the 10 Commandments, or the so-called 10 Commandments, which, as I mentioned in many of my classes, is really a misnomer because the Torah never refers to them as commandments, but rather Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 statements, because there are actually 14 commandments in that body of 10 statements, and in the Torah there are a total of 613. But whatever terminology we use, those 10 commandments or 10 statements were given on the 6th day of the month of Sivan, and that's what we celebrate when we celebrate the holiday of Shavuot, the anniversary of the giving of the Torah, as we say in our prayers, Zman Matan Toratenu. It's the season of the giving of our Torah. Now, when we look at the 10 statements, the very last one is Lo Tachmo, don't covet. Don't be envious of what your neighbor has, whether it's property, whether it's his wife. We're not supposed to be envious of another person's possessions. Why is that the last of the commandments? Usually something that comes at the end is either the sum total of everything else, or it's the most important commandment. There's an expression of the Talmud, everything follows the chitum, the end, the conclusion, the seal. But if you think a little bit about it, we know that the first sin committed against another human being, the first sin committed was Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. But the first sin committed against a human being was the sin of Cain and Abel, Cain killing Hevel. Why did Cain kill Hevel? He was jealous. The simple understanding is that when he brought an offering to God, God was not pleased. When Abel brought an offering, God was very pleased. So it created rivalry and envy. In the Midrash, it says that there was actually more than that, just that. They were fighting over the additional twin sister. We know when each one was born, they were born with a twin sister, but there was an additional twin sister, and they were fighting over the additional twin sister. Another Midrash says they were fighting over where ultimately the Beit HaMikdash would be built, in Cain's territory and Abel's territory. That reflects, those two different Midrashic accounts reflect two different reasons for rivalry and enmity. One could be based on pure materialistic concerns. Who's going to get the extra sister as a wife? Or it could be a spiritual rivalry. Either way, it leads to negative consequences. So the very first sin in all of society was the sin of rivalry, where they couldn't get along, where each one wanted what the other one had, or was unhappy that they didn't have what the other one had. Somehow, that attitude was deeply ingrained in humanity from the very beginning of civilization. And it seems that it will be the very last trait to be uprooted. Maimonides, whose work, Mishnah Torah, we've just concluded, 41st time, instituted by the Rabbi to study Maimonides every day, 3 chapters a day to finish it in less than a year, or 1 chapter to finish it in about 3 years. So we just concluded it a little while ago, and the very last paragraph, Maimonides writes, at that time there will be no more hunger, there will be no more war, and then he says there will be no more jealousy and rivalry. That means that everyone will be happy with what they have. There will be no violation of the 10th so-called commandment, Lo Tachmo, don't covet what your fellow has. The question could be asked, why is this the hardest trait to uproot? A lot of other traits, negative traits we have, it doesn't seem to be as ingrained in us as this one. And the simple answer could be that that's what happened at the beginning of time, and that was ingrained in humanity, so therefore it's around for the longest period of time, and therefore it's the hardest to expunge. That could be one answer, but I'd like to give another answer from a Jewish perspective. And that is, Lo Tachmo, don't covet, means we have to respect boundaries. It says when the Jewish people were in the desert, and even Bilam, the heathen prophet, saw this and praised it. He saw that when they pitched their tents, everyone made sure that the entrance of his tent should not face the entrance of another person's tent. They went out of their way to ensure that because they did not want to invade the other person's privacy. There was no voyeurism. There was no desire to break the boundaries, go through the borders. The respect for boundaries is a hallmark of Judaism. Judaism tells us there's a boundary between Shabbat and the weekdays. There's a boundary between one person's rights and another person's rights. Everyone has to respect each other's boundary. But Judaism doesn't believe in absolute boundaries in many cases, which means, yes, it's my house and you have your house, but you know what? I could invite you into my house. I could allow you to enjoy my property and my possessions. I have money and you don't. Well, you have to respect my boundaries. You can't just take my money just because you're poor and I'm rich. You can't say that you're entitled because you're poor. There are people who believe that shoplifting is okay if you're poor. No, it isn't. And a thief of 1 penny in spiritual terms is no better than a thief of $1 billion, because theft is wrong unless it's to save your life. That's a different story. So there are boundaries between my property and your property, between all of our properties. That's true. But there are times when God wants us to override the boundaries, to invite the person into my life, to give of my possessions to that needy person. So that, yes, while there's a boundary, we find that Jacob and his father-in-law, Lavan, they made up that there's going to be a gal, a pile of stones, a barrier that should demarcate each person's turf, and I'm not going to cross over, you're not going to cross over, except, as our sages explain, if we want to do business, we can go over the wall. There are times when you could break through the boundaries, transcend the boundaries, but you have to respect the boundaries first and then transcend them. Well, this is a balancing act. Whenever you have two imperatives, the imperative of respecting boundaries and the imperative of transcending boundaries, there's always a danger that the transcending of the boundary will do away with boundaries, period. And you'll feel entitled, like you're a benefactor, you're a philanthropist, you're helping out. So you feel you can take liberty with other people's property because, after all, I share. There are no boundaries. We're all equal, which is the philosophy of socialism, where everyone is sharing from the same pot and everyone is living together and there's no ownership in anything. You know what that leads to? That leads to breaking down boundaries in ways that are not healthy. Therefore, there's a balancing act between respecting boundaries and overriding the boundaries, transcending them. And because we have that other imperative countering the boundaries, that's why it's the hardest from a spiritual vantage point to maintain those boundaries. Now, what's interesting, that the 10 commandments, or the 10 statements, were given in 2 tablets, 5 commandments or 5 statements on one tablet and 5 statements on another tablet. And by the way, the tablets, the way they're depicted as being round on the top, is a total error. The tablets were cubes, and they had no round features to them. That's clearly stated in the Talmud, and it would be a good thing for people when they depict the tablets to do it the Jewish way. I think the round one came from Michelangelo's depiction, and that has no basis in truth. At any rate, there were 2 tablets. God could have given 1 long tablet with 10 statements. Why did God give 5 here and 5 there? So the simple explanation is the 5 on one side are the commandments between man and God, and the 5 on the other side are commandments between man and man, within society, societal norms, and the other ones are spiritual norms. But there's also another way. The Midrash also explains that we could read the 10 statements 2 different ways. We can read them vertically, 1 through 5, 6 through 10, or we could read them horizontally, 1 and 6, 2 and 7, 3 and 8, 4 and 9, and 5 and 10. What is the 10th commandment, not to covet, creating boundaries. What does it have to do with honoring your parents, your father and mother? How does one relate to the other? Well, in light of what we explained before, it has a very beautiful relationship because boundaries can exist in 3 different domains. Sefer Yetzirah, the early book of Kabbalah, attributed to Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, says that everything in existence comes in 3 different domains. They are olam, world, space, shana, year or time, nefesh, soul or energy. In all of these 3 areas, there are boundaries that have to be respected. When it comes to makom, to space, my house, your house, the commandment says don't covet property that isn't yours. That's respecting boundaries in space. This is my land, no trespassing. Yes, Judaism does respect ownership of property, private ownership, and unless you invite someone into your home, that person cannot just assume that it's all okay to come in. So that's boundaries in space. But then we have boundaries in soul, that I cannot take liberties with other people and just feel I could enter into their lives, intrude into their lives, invade their privacy, not just physical privacy, but spiritual privacy. I can find out things about them. I could just go beneath the surface and try to find all their skeletons that they have. That's called boundaries in soul. We cannot invade the privacy of others into their personal lives unless they invite us in. And that's what you're supposed to do when you're a rabbi, a teacher, a parent, a therapist. You're supposed to, because you have permission. You were asked to probe into that person's psyche and their soul to find out what they need and to become a better person. So you're breaking the boundaries, but with permission. You're transcending the boundaries in a proper way, in a kosher way. And then you have boundaries in time, that parents come from an earlier generation. Teachers are older usually than the students. They come from an earlier generation. You have to respect seniority. And you could say, well, why should I respect my parents? I'm smarter than my parents. But the Torah says you have to respect the earlier generation. They are one generation and you are another generation. And because you came later, it's not your fault. You have to show respect to the earlier generation, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher. However, just like sometimes you have to transcend boundaries, inviting people into your home, inviting people into your life, going into someone else's home, going into someone else's life with permission, the same way there's transcending even those divisions between father and child, mother and child. It says in the last biblical book, Malachi, that a day will come, Elijah the prophet will come, and he will restore the hearts of the fathers with the children or through the children. That means that the children will bring their fathers back, and the fathers will become united with their children. What that means is we're going to breach the boundaries. The boundary that says that a father is the one who imparts knowledge to the child, and the child is on the receiving end. The child, the young generation, will inform and teach and inspire the older generation. The Talmud says that before Mashiach comes, there'll be a lot of chutzpah. I don't have to translate the word chutzpah. It became an English word. And chutzpah is a negative trait, generally speaking. But the Rebbe says, no, it's a positive trait, that the younger generation has this idealism, this altruism, that they could inspire the older generation and bring them back. It has to be done respectfully, of course. But just because there's a boundary doesn't mean we can't surmount that boundary. We can't override it and transcend it. So this holiday of Shavuot, it's the holiday when God gave us the Torah, where we have to recognize there are boundaries between the spiritual and the physical, but yet God allowed the spiritual and the physical to coalesce, to unite, to synthesize. But you have to recognize what is spiritual, what is physical. That's why when we pray, Hasidim wear a gartel, a sash, to separate between the upper part of their body, their mind, their heart, from the lower parts of the body. Ultimately, the lower parts of the body are also part of serving God. And there's a synthesis between the upper and the lower. But you have to recognize this is upper, this is lower. You have to respect the boundaries, and then you bring them together. May God bless everyone with a traditional blessing that the Rebbe would always give for the holiday of Shavuot, Kabbalat HaTorah b'simcha u'b'pnimiyut, that we should receive the Torah first with joy and inwardness. We should internalize it. And may everyone have a good Yom Tov.